Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We are now moving into the final sections of our discussion of the early period of English settlement. We're going to talk about the transition of the colonies from fragile, weak, and unstable to, by the time of the American Revolution, being relatively cohesive, stable, and strong. Along the way, there is much instability, much conflict, and much upheaval, which I discussed at the end of the previous lecture. There are all kinds of kind of fault lines creating internal conflict within the colonies. So as we conclude this early discussion of colonial life, and in the next chapter we're going to talk much more about all of these kinds of factors, I want to talk about three particular incidents of upheaval within the English colonies. And as we talk about each one, you want to keep in mind things like who is in power, who is not in power, and what are they upset about? What action do both sides take? How does the government or whatever group is in power respond? And how are the incidents resolved? We're going to be talking about three different ones, beginning in this lecture with a war known as King Philip's War. In American history, of course, the year 1776 carries a special resonance. It is the year of our independence. It is celebrated in our history above all other years. And yet often overlooked is the fact that 100 years prior was another pivotal year in our nation's history. 1676, in some ways, just as important as 1776, although much less celebrated. And two of the significant events we're going to be talking about occurred in that year, 1676. Beginning with this war, King Philip's War, which actually begins in 1675. So the origins of this war are the expansion of the New England colony increasingly into what at that time was Indian territory. And of course, everything was initially controlled by the Indians, but the New England colony is spreading out into Indian-controlled territory. And those Indians were growing increasingly frustrated. Their population had been devastated by disease. From the time of the arrival of European settlers, the population of Indians had declined by about tenfold, from 120,000 to only about 12,000. The Indians were also frustrated that they were being cheated out of their land, were growing increasingly dependent on whites, and were losing their ability to hunt game as that game was growing more and more scarce. So by the late 17th century, Indian-white relations in this region were a powder keg waiting for a spark. Now, by the mid to late 17th century in this area, we were starting to see the beginnings of Indian unity, although we're not there yet. There were lots of different groups, and if you remember back to some of my discussions in the very first chapter, we talked about the great diversity among Indian groups. They were not used to cooperating with each other necessarily. There was a lot of conflict and rivalry between the groups. But we're going to start to see the beginnings of what is known as Pan-Indianism with this war, King Philip's War. Pan-Indianism meaning a sort of cooperation and unity among Indian tribes. So as the English are expanding into Indian territory, the Indians have three different options. They can submit, in other words, sell their land to the English and then work for the English. Or they can sell their lands and try to leave, migrate to the west, perhaps find some protection among other Indian groups, but they're just as likely to find conflict. Or they can try to unite and fight against the English. And the Wampanoags, under the leadership of Metacom, who is known to the English as King Philip, choose option 3. They're going to try to unite and fight against the English. Now, the spark for this war was a Christianized Indian named John Sassamon. Sassamon warned the English settlers that the Indians were planning a revolt. Because he had done that, 3 Indians captured and murdered John Sassamon, and the white community then hunted down the offending Indians and executed them. The Indian community rebelled. The ensuing war is known as King Philip's War. Again, this is pictured here is Metacom, or King Philip. And this is, by many measures, the most fatal war in our nation's history. Although on the whole, you're dealing with smaller numbers than with wars like World War I or World War II. The percentages would say this is among the bloodiest wars in American history. The Indian population was wiped out. 4,000 killed or wounded. Many others were sold as slaves or became refugees. 1 in 10 white males were killed, and virtually every family was affected. 20% of English towns were burned, as were almost all Indian towns. Both sides in this war were brutal and cruel. Indians had long used torture as a technique for warfare, and in this war they captured many of the English, whom they hoped would replace some of their own who had been killed. But in order to accomplish that, typically they would torture their victims in the belief that that would remove their soul from the body and they could then replace Indians who had been killed. So the English respond with similar brutality, and there's a lot of torture on both sides. The English make this a total war, meaning that men, women, children, the elderly, everyone was fair game. And as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, the Indians typically did not fight this way. They did not believe and understand total war. But both sides engage in brutal techniques during this war. While the Indians fought bravely and did well early on in the war, eventually the English were too well supplied, and the Indians ran out of supplies and ammunition. In a final blow to the Indians, the English captured and killed Metacom, chopped him into pieces, and sent the pieces to various Indian villages. The English won the war, and the Indians in the New England area were essentially eliminated. So what were the results of this incredibly brutal war? Well, first of all, it really ended all hope of a multiracial society, or at least a happy, cooperative multiracial society in that region. As I mentioned, the Indians are essentially eliminated after this. It also marked the beginning of a sort of pan-Indian movement. We're going to be coming back to this idea later in the course a number of times, as eventually Indian cultures and societies begin to realize that their only hope of resisting the expansion of English control is to unite and fight together. As I've mentioned, it's not very successful in this war, but we do see the beginnings of that idea. And finally, and I think for our purposes the most important in the longer term, is that this war, along with some of the other things that are happening in the colonies at the same time, inspired the belief in England that the colonies cannot take care of themselves. I described earlier in our lectures that most of the colonial charters included some sort of clause that if things got out of control, the Crown could seize control of the colonies and restore order. And in fact, the Massachusetts Bay Charter was revoked in 1684 in the aftermath of this war. So to put this in context, one historian named Stephen Saunders has written a book called 1676, The End of American Independence, which is an interesting play on the idea of American independence beginning in 1776. The thought here is that 1676 in some ways marks the end of American independence, which eventually will have to be restored after the American Revolution. It's an interesting approach to this conflict. Now in the next lecture we're going to talk about another pivotal event from 1676, in this case Bacon's Rebellion.